So I hand over to Calvin. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for everybody for sticking with us. I'm sure you'll agree with me, it's been a fantastic range of talks today and many, many different perspectives on Frink, which is certainly going to help me over the next few months. I think what we're going to do, I'm going to direct questions sort of down the panel, and maybe sort of two, three questions, and then we'll open it out to all of you to contribute. But I think to begin with, I was going to go back to maybe something that Kit, that you said, and that was to do with drawing, really. And for me, although principally a sculptor, I see Elisabeth Frink as a great draftsman. And I wondered whether you could give us your thoughts on her draftsmanship and how that related, perhaps in your case, to the printmaking. And I guess I picked up in my talk about how within the art college system there was some resistance to that tradition, and that at one stage it really was resisted and frowned upon. But to her, I think it was fundamental to everything.
Right. Yeah, drawing is very important to her, of course. As I said, I think her drawing fell into two categories. In a sense, you know, when you're looking at the difference between the portrait sculpture and the rest of the work, there's a type of drawing which is free-flowing and drawing from very deep inside the head rather than from a still life or something that you're trying to capture. And that she was particularly good at, and I have no idea where that comes from in anybody who draws that way. Because sort of things together, and she was doing the big heads, and you saw the photograph of that going on. She had not long since made the Desert Quartet and the Riachi bronzes and so on, and so she was. That was kicking around inside. So that was good. The other thing is that we did have some conversations about lazy drawing. I'll just finish that off, and oh no, that's lazy drawing, and then there's a reversal and you go back. So I think she was pretty harsh critic of herself, and that's really where I'd stop.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been mentioned earlier about this very early show she had in Cambridge of drawings, which I think were described as many of them being bird motif drawings, which I find really interesting in a sense that she was beginning to work through these motifs that would appear in sculpture much later, and many British sculptors of that period.
That's right.
I mean, they inhabit the same world. So clearly there are external influences at play here, but particularly struck with the bird motif, where you think that might have come from, or how she approached it in her work different to other of her contemporaries.
Yes, so within the Ingram collection we've actually got a lot of sculpture, a lot of mid-century sculpture, and there's a lot of work by artists that we've talked about today, so Bernard Meadows, Chadwick, all those sorts of people that and they also use that kind of, there's the bird motif in that as well in the early 1950s. For me, I think, and what I have kind of repeatedly read as something that has been really interesting in terms of the formation of the bird sculpture, was that experience she had as a child in Suffolk with she saw, an airman falling out of the sky in flames. And I think that's something that really, you can see that throughout the work, actually. In terms of the birds, I think it's important to see that looking after a private collection and thinking about Chris's emotional response to Frink's work. He particularly loves the bird sculpture so much that he has had one of her warrior bird drawings, which is I think a 1959 piece, but actually with your dad's consent, he had it put on the lining of his favourite jacket so that he could kind of wear it all the time. But I think I think what he was trying to say with that is the bird is such a key motif for her and such an important part of the work.
Can you, going back more specifically to drawing,
Yes.
With Chris as an example, was it the sculpture or the drawing that he first engaged with?
So with him it was the sculpture, and I think what's interesting about Frink, and we kind of talked briefly before about the lack of institutional support, but Chris was kind of coming at her work when he first started buying. He didn't really know much about the period, he didn't know anything about modern British art, value to him, and so then he looked at all the other aspects of her work and collected the drawings. We've got the baboon, which you showed earlier. So it was the sculptures first, but he's also got a particular interest in how sculptors draw, so which is very different, I think. So we've also got Hepworth's drawings, and I think there's a tangible difference to a sculptor's drawing.
It's something, again, in the exhibition that I'm developing. I think the idea of showing the sculptures and the drawings alongside each other is very important, and to treat them on the same level. So that's something that I completely agree with. Tully, if I can move to you, and maybe some of your earliest memories of the works as you saw them growing up, and how maybe, I mean, I suspect the sculptures probably had a great presence than...
Yeah, I mean, without sounding too insulting to the work, they almost became part of the garden, quite ornamental in a way, because they were just there. And to a child with the innate ignorance that they possess, they kind of, you just see things for what they are. Yeah, lots of imagination growth, both of us, and obviously Bree's an artist. I was going to as much, but yeah, I kind of parallel it to maybe how medieval Britons saw Roman remains, like this divine creator long gone, but not quite understanding it, but in awe of it. And obviously it's had a profound impact on our existence, and our future. So I kind of parallel it to that in a way.
Okay. Moving to you, Bree, sticking with drawing, and you're currently at Art College, and you've heard certain people like myself today talk about how perhaps drawing doesn't quite have the position in artistic practice that it once did. What sympathies do you have for your grandmother and her insistence on the importance of drawing as a sculptor? I mean, are you now are you drawing yourself? Is it part of your artistic world? Or?
Obviously, I've been influenced by her work, like growing up, and like what Tully was saying, not really understanding like the gravity of the concept or kind of the idea behind it. It's just more just being around it and surrounded by it. I guess the way I saw her prints and her drawings, and the way I see kind of drawing is a way of kind of constructing like an idea and a kind of a presence of an idea. When I see like the Walking Men, it's kind of like a just construction of what she either wanted to kind of make into a sculpture. I know what you mean by drawing is not kind of taking that seriously. It is like it's an idea, it's a concept that you just put straight into paper and you work from that maybe. But it is an art form in itself, and it does relate, I think, just as important.
It'd be interesting to know if she went, if she didn't draw them, if she went straight into the physical work, 3D space, how it would have turned out.
Yeah, yeah.
You never know.
There is another kind of drawing too, which is, I mean, I saw it happen, which is drawings after something's been made to understand what you've done. And that's a whole different game. I mean, you're not exploring anything new. You're not trying to figure out where you're going to go. It's where you've been.
Yeah,
it's reflecting on something. Yeah.
And sometimes it's good not to have a plan.
Absolutely.
Spontaneity can really rule supreme sometimes.
I think that's what she kind of aimed for. Because I remember Dad telling me, like, she would try and work as fast as possible before like the idea would kind of fleet away. So she wanted to put it down on paper.
Wants to record it.
Plaster. Exactly, yeah. And that was the main, I think the focus of her was just to get that idea out straight away.
Yeah, and using drawing as an example, I know when I draw, if I think about it too much and focus on detail, which I am inclined to brain, to hand, to eye, it always turns out way better. And what you're after, usually. So, yeah.
Does anybody want to add anything on drawing and the importance of drawing before we move on? Oh, yeah. Yes.
Shall I just shout?
Yes, just shout. There's a microphone coming, actually.
Does it work? Hello.
Hello.
I was at Chelsea at the same time that she was teaching there, or doing some teaching there. And, well, as a 17-year-old kid. And what caught my ear just now was the thing about lazy drawing. What I enjoyed about working with her was this exuberance and going around the studios in her boots and, you know, being this very powerful woman. Although she can't have been more than about 24 or something like that then. It was a very exciting time for me, and I just wanted to pay tribute. So that's all, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there's one at the back.
I've just been sitting here as I was listening to you, trying to draw those heads on that photograph. And, so this is a completely sort of off-the-cuff comment. And two things I've noticed. Does anybody else think that really both those faces are terribly similar to hers?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that actually...
The nose.
Go back and have a look at that now, having seen the images of her. I think it's, you know, it's very obviously a self-portrait of her.
You see her big, long, powerful nose and very long chin. It's quite... Anyway, perhaps everybody else knew that. And the other thing, just reflecting on the Green Men drawings in particular, the way she uses the lines to almost make the contours of the drawing is very much somebody who knows the tactility of those heads, who's describing three-dimensional form and contour, as opposed to just pulling out the features or whatever. As a way of drawing, she was drawing as a sculptor and describing the form even on a print, I observe.
Yeah.
I'd agree.
What I think is actually really interesting, and I think that's something which we ought to, you know, is something that's very interesting in terms of considering her work, and in terms of that physicality and powerfulness.
Yeah. Well, I think there was the question earlier.
Yes, exactly.
Staying an
Exactly.
artist through the 50s, into
Yeah.
the 60s.
And having a family.
Taking some very intimidating photos and
Yeah.
staring directly in the lens. I like
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was the question earlier about whether there was a link with Barbara Hepworth, which I think in terms of the work I don't really think exists at all, but I know that Elizabeth Frink talked very fondly about Hepworth, and when they'd met I think she admired her enormously. But we only really link them together, I guess, because
As women.
they're women, and prominent artists. But I think, I don't think there is any, but that has often perhaps been problematic, and maybe is part of the reason that I was suggesting that her work hasn't always been sort of placed, because it tends to sort of sit aside.
There is another thread that runs through this. I mean, Liz was part of Waddington Gallery for a long time, and at a moment when Leslie changed direction, she was one of the people who was sort of released, I suppose, would be the nicest way of putting it. And her solution to this sort of marketing problem was to have weekend house parties with, they'd host 8 or 10 people who'd come and stay. And as Alex said, generally somebody went away with a pretty considerable piece of sculpture.
That's nice.
Now the thing is, that as a way of...
In her early period, she doesn't quite fit in with the whole geometry of fear, sort of post-war British sculptors. She's a little bit younger, and she wasn't included in the Venice show. And it's almost as if that the dealers, therefore, they don't quite know where to place her early work. And then, of course, by 1960, the new generation, its sculptures moved somewhere else, and she doesn't quite fit there either. And it's around, I guess it was a little bit later that Waddington stopped showing here. It was probably the early 70s. Fashion plays a part in this. I wanted to, and I'll start with you again, Kip, if I may, because I think you mentioned it first, was the work ethic, and thinking about her studio practice, and you get a sense of someone who who works incredibly hard, and the level of skill involved, and if we can expand this out to think about the transferring into printmaking, and also in terms of the foundry, the levels of craftsmanship and skill involved in this work, and your feelings about that now, because I think there's a current interest in skill again and in craft. Perhaps for a while there hasn't been. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in terms of the day, apart from the breakfast and working, before breakfast, there was, a kind of country life. But on hitting the studio, in terms of the armatures, this is drawing on local agricultural skills. People who work locally, who mend tractors, who are good at doing it, and they become friends, and you can say, can you take that there and do that? And so that stuff's going on all the time. A complete disregard for health and safety. I don't know. Just hard driven, because every day is precious.
And we've heard it from you, we've heard it from Andrew in terms of casting of bronze. Can you tell us something about those skills that are involved, and how that works?
Well, with each process, there's a whole load to be learned, and actually life is too short to become a real expert on processing etching plates or photo technology. You want to go from what's in here on to what you get out there. And so practically it would involve, for instance, with the big horse head, she went down to the stables, drew the outline, because I said what you need is an outline. You need a guide, and then on top of that goes a transparent material which can then be drawn on. And I'm making all the mixtures for her, so again, she wouldn't know what was in it, but the thing that breaks down into a wash is a particular mixture. The one that will act like a pepper pot duster is another one. And essentially it's just, it's kind of Zen detachment, where she'd say, all right, it's done, let's just leave it. And it has to dry for 2 or 3 hours. That's how it is. And like with the foundry, there will be somebody saying, you can use this, but you better use a face mask, and we don't want it to blow up on you, and so all that stuff is happening. And I mean, all these things, ever since people have made work, they've always been a team effort. And although Rose was working in the studio on her own, there were lots of other people. I mean, an army.
Work into printmaking or into bronze. It's about collaboration.
Whereas Hepworth and Moore did. And that's maybe one of the key differences between Barbara Hepworth and her.
Joe, can I ask you, thinking that her working life, she did pack a lot in. The quality of what she produced in a relatively short period of time. I'm always kind of fascinated and sort of speculating what she might have gone on to do. But if we stick with what she did achieve.
Very tiring to go to the studio every day, and then put the chicken wire on the armature and do the plaster, put the plaster on, mould it, wait for it to dry. And that's, you would know much better than me, but that's an exhausting thing. And to keep that up day in, day out, and as you say, to maintain a kind of a real interest in things. There's lots of stories that she's, where she's been interviewed, where she takes her inspiration from new things, like Sarah was saying, from a photograph. So there's very famously the goggle head, which was inspired by, I think, someone called General Oufkir from the the Algerian wars of, back in the 60s. And that was something that really struck her. And again, with the Riace warriors. I would like to think kind of where she would have gone on to might be, I was very interested that the Riace warriors have painted faces, and maybe she might have done a bit more experimentation with painting on bronze and what that brings to it. And I would have, I think that might be where she might have gone. But I think the reason that she's so incredibly well thought of, recharge and gain a different perspective, which I think might be interesting to talk about as well.
I was just going to add, actually, I think it's interesting when an artist has a very recognisable style. And I think once you've got your eye, and it doesn't take very long, that you can spot a Frink, a mile off. And that's not true for every artist. I mean, clearly someone like Moore and Hepworth, if we're discussing, then they have that similar kind of, you kind of know what you're dealing with.
And she's very much part of our public arena. You know, we've talked about, Frink spotting, and you do see her around, and it's when you get to know her work, then you realise, oh gosh, I've walked past that, however many times in my life. So she is definitely part of our public consciousness, I think, as an artist.
Yeah, she's on First Dates. I don't know if any of you watch First Dates, but
sometimes,
so she's bleeding into our culture.
Yes, exactly.
Modern society.
Yeah.
Base your kind of passion on and your creative drive, because it just keeps on evolving. And if you're that passionate about it, the quality of work will be perpetuated almost. You know what I mean? So.
You're right. Like within the in memoriam heads, the emotion there is incredible, isn't it? So you're right.
Yeah, the emotion.
So how did you two feel swimming in the pool with a baboon? For those that don't know, there's a big swimming pool with an enormous baboon mosaic at the bottom. And I mean, you were saying you grew up with this stuff.
The baboon raised a lot of questions. Why is it underwater? I don't know. And like I said earlier, our imaginations have really developed in such an awesome and unique way from it. But it was just such a wild place to grow up, and the house itself really represented her nicely, because I think she really was quite a feral lady, inside, but really contemporary and sophisticated at the same time, and really stoic. But growing up there was really our house was so much more fun. No, they loved it. The freedom there. I think creativity just flourished there because of the nature, the untamperedness. So I think my friends really, where their houses were so kind of confined and structured, and I don't know, they had the kind of conventional domestic setup. Ours was so different. It was very refreshing for my friends that came over, and they always loved it. Didn't want to go. We usually return them naked.
And what about your grandmother's work ethic? Has that
That's one thing
transcended the generations?
It has. Creatively, I'm really quite lazy. There's so many creative pursuits that I've got in my mind, writing mainly. But I've just kind of got distracted, sometimes intentionally. And I've started working with children in a school setting, so that's just kind of taken over a little bit. But since Dad passing, I've gone part-time, and lots of doors have opened within the art world. And when it comes to a work ethic, that's one thing that I've always, or as I've got older, I can appreciate more and more from her, because I could see as I get older and I work.
They have a lot of fun.
Yeah, and balance. She seemed to balance. That's why her routine was so good. It was almost, 9 to 5 type thing. She had that balance there. It was raw intensity, and then it was the deep pressurizing moment in the evening, family and food, music. So she's kept that balance there. I really appreciate that. So I'm very much into philosophy and stuff, so I think she's a bit of a stoic sage, I think, So.
Bree, how's the work ethic at college? Is that holding up? Or?
Well, the dissertation was last week. that was interesting. I definitely do take inspiration from her kind of, how she worked and how she approached the studio. I find it hard at university because there's always like a kind of space limit where you can work and who's around you, and there's always kind of just leave and host parties, and it'll be like her pulling funny faces, because I've seen some of the photos like her with my dad and stuff like that, just like pulling funny faces, having a laugh, just trying to be like embodying someone, kind of her usual self.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of separation is really interesting. It's kind of like a performance piece in itself, really. Like imagine if someone was watching her working, it would be like a performance piece, where she would kind of chisel away or kind of plaster. But But I've always found that quite hard, especially at university when everything's crowded and there's different personalities around. But yeah, I think that's just the education kind of system, maybe.
That's another thing about her. I don't think she pandered to bullshit. And I think, that can, as we see so many times of success and fame, that can really happen. You can start, all that stuff that doesn't need your energy starts taking more and more of your energy, and that obviously takes energy out of the work. So I don't think she gave to that as much, maybe, as most people do. I think that served her image very well.
Kip, can I go back to you? Because unlike the rest of us, you had the pleasure of spending much time with her and got to know her. Can you tell us something more about her?
Tough. Right. First of all, she and Alex were a great double act. And totally different, completely different. I mean, he was from the world of sort of insurance and I can't remember what the name of the company was. But anyway, you would all know insurance and banking and things. But his joy was to put on his jerkin and go out and shoot things, which is sort of somewhat at variance with Liz. But on the other hand, she was a country girl, so that was there. Eating was really big in the house, really, really big deal. And cooking was a competition, who can really make something that floats the boat. Stopped. And the parties were great. It was just a very civilized household. Probably one you kind of felt the echoes of all the way through. I mean,
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Not the parties so much, but...
Well, no, the parties were business, you see.
Ah, right, of course.
I mean, once you've got the 10 people there, you need to encourage them.
Hungarian champagne.
No, I think her collection of various artworks and just kind of artifacts and just kind of strange things had a massive impact on my kind of creative kind of life. I mean, there'd be muskets, swords in there. But they're literally in the corner, so I could literally pick up a sword and be 10 years old with a metal sword.
Exceptional artist. He inherited all her draftsmanly qualities and made some really, really good work. So let's hope the genetic works.
Yeah, I can feel it. Just not capitalising on it. Yeah. No, talking about Dad though, we spoke a bit at lunch about it. Obviously, he had quite an interesting journey within art. I don't know if he felt obliged to follow that path or not. I know music was always there for him as well. He's the only child, His dad died early as well. But when it comes to his artwork, I actually much prefer his early illustrations. Some of them are quite commercial, but I just feel it really represented his character more than anything. His kind of dark humour, edgy, really quirky ideas, and lots of allegorical kind of meaning into them, and I love all that. So, and then I love his prints as well, but you can see the influence. But I think if you buy your own ingredients, it's a lot better. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas if someone's giving you a whole lot of stuff, you're kind of limited to what you can cook in the end. But if you step out the front door yourself, you've got a blank canvas in your mind.
Especially if they've taught you to draw.
Exactly. Yeah. But
How much did your dad talk about your grandmother?
not ever. Well, he didn't at all.
At all.
So I'm only kind of learning now more and more by coming to days like this, which is really interesting. And I do want to learn more about it all, about her and about the industry, because I find it interesting and we're part of it. So I want to know more about it.
Yeah, there is a good story when Dad was, I think, in sixth form or school. He was a bit rebellious, kind of got kicked out for a couple of days, and he was really worried that Elizabeth would be really angry and I'd tell him off. But I think she got him up to London and then do loads of prints, and that was his punishment, just to do artwork, to actually do work. I think that's a really good reflection of her as like a mother.
Yeah, his repayment was to go to Julian Trevelyan's studio and make etchings.
Yes, exactly.
It's a punishment, but it's keeping him on the track.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
He gets a good portfolio out of it.
It's a good way of doing it. Yeah, but like I said, he didn't really talk about it. I think there was a lot of sore areas, and we embraced that. So we never really talked. And it's just odd. I think when someone's died before you can remember them, you don't bring them up. I don't know. It just feels like a red zone. Yeah, it did to me anyway. I think maybe if she died when I was 10 and I had some memories of her, then I might have asked him more about her. But yeah, like I said, it's that divine creator long gone. So.
Joe, can I ask you, Chris Ingram, he must have known Elizabeth Frink.
No, I don't think he ever met
he
her.
Didn't,
No.
He wasn't buying before she died.
So he never met her, and sort of what I was saying earlier was that when he discovered the period, basically he sold his business, had always been interested in art, and is the first to say he's completely obsessive, and was going around some galleries thinking, what shall I buy? And basically an academic approach to buying art at all. As I said, it's completely based on his visual response, and he's from advertising. He has a very kind of visual background, and that's what makes him tick. And so with Frink's work, and I think it's what Sarah said earlier. Kind of that which moves us most has no words, and I think that absolutely encapsulates Frink's work and the way that we are all so moved by her. I would say.
So, can I open up again? Any questions on some of the themes we're developing? Yeah.
Did she collect herself or buy her own art?
We just need it on the mic.
Did Liz Frink buy art herself? Did she buy other artists' work? Do you know? Were you aware of the work
she
of other
did,
artists?
didn't she?
Yeah.
And if so, can you...
Yeah, but not in a way that you might understand, John. Yes, they were friends, and
Didn't she trade and exchange pieces for pieces a lot as well? So it was quite an intimate, endless box of them. Most of it chipped.
I want to thank you all, everyone, for the day. It's absolutely marvellous, and some of the ideas that have come out of these discussions have been so fertile. But there is one word that seems to me to be a sort of suppressed word in the discussion, which is making me feel a bit odd, a bit like when I first realised my students didn't know what communism was, which is feminism. The 2 decades that you talked about when she wasn't really exhibited, it wasn't surely just that she was not figurative. It was that she didn't create a feminist narrative in her art. Had she done that, there would have been perhaps quite a lot of galleries. Kip, you talked about one of the drawings of the heads as being a mensch. And yet that's not a word she obviously felt excluded by in any way. And if you think of the semiotics of feminism in those decades, anything which had man in it, was something which was supposed to be irrelevant to women and therefore to be suppressed. This is clearly not what she was doing. She was doing something much more profound in being a powerful woman, working in a powerful medium, which Vicky said is powerful both physically and morally, but also has an inherent vulnerability. Isn't that just encapsulating humanity, mankind, our challenge in knowing who we are and why we're here? And she's doing it as a woman through her work without any of the feminist narrative that was so popular in those decades. And I just think that's so important to realise, because it's so wonderful. And that's why now we're understanding her work so much better and realising who she was.
Yeah.
And I thought your poem, by the way, the Ted Hughes poem.
I think it's, agreement. Thank you.
Hello, I'd just like to ask if anyone can give me any insight into what kind of a mother she was, because I know Barbara Hepworth had quite a distant relationship with her children because she was such a driven woman. Do you know anything? Perhaps did your dad give any insight into what she was like? Was she quite distant from him, or she was so ambitious?
I think she was a bit of both, from what I gathered, and I can't really delve into it too much because you didn't talk about her that much, but I think she kind of swang with her energies and approached it consistent. So, and he was an only child as well, so I think he was quite alone for some of it, but I think she was a great mother as well, from what I've been told too. I think she was a great mother. Bit of both. But that's often the way.
Do you think that being a mother perhaps stopped her getting on a little bit? Because, it's very difficult to be all things. And if you've got small children, and did that stop her getting accepted by some of the galleries?
Not sure. I mean, she seemed seriously focused on what she was doing. And like you said, the 9 to 5, you come in, you do it, and then you come away from it. I know from what Dad told me recently, when he was ill, that she tried getting him involved a lot in her art, and he wasn't interested, so she did want him there.
Like you said, quite rebellious. Yeah. But she did try and engage and trying to get him involved. But I think maybe being in like kind of a celebrity figure as well, I think that might have a big part in it as well. Kind of the limelight of being an artist and successful kind of hindered his view on it. I remember him doing shows next to her work, and I don't think he liked it. It was kind of like comparing his work to hers, which it's just natural. I think it's just natural to happen. That's just how things flow. It's just one of those hard things you gotta. I don't think he kind of understood or learn how to kind of deal with it in a kind of professional way. So
by the time I was around the household, Lan had long since gone and had his band Angle tracks and so on, and he was doing a lot of illustration work for television companies and things like that. And as I was saying to Tully earlier on, Liz would dig stuff out and say, look, this is really good, he draws better than I do. And she was deeply proud of him. And I think
saw the value in it and the idea in it and the skill that Dad had and voiced it to him. So in that regard, she was a very cool mum.
More questions? Okay, one down the front.
Thank you to the person who talked about feminism. I was going to ask something along those lines, but I had another question about music. I know your dad was very talented in the field of music, amongst other things, but I understand Liz Frink had quite an interesting selection of music that she particularly liked. Can anybody tell us about it, about the music that she liked?
All over the studio wall were Ravel, and then whatever. As she listened to the radio, things that she loved, she'd just write on the wall. The contemporary or modernist music was big, and we won't stray into the God-line date on the TV.
I'm interested in a bit more about how she worked. So some artists work really quickly. Other artists, say, like Eileen Cooper, will take a year or 18 months working, reworking a picture. We've heard Kip very interesting descriptions of how there's sort of immediacy of printmaking. And I wonder how she did other bits, how her sculptures worked, whether they were done very quickly or whether they were reworked and reworked. How did she work in that sort of way?
I don't really know. I mean, I would be there and something would be half made, and then it might be finished when I was next there. I really don't know. Just a lot of energy went into it. Surforms and chisels and by my standards, awful dirtiness.
can see the thumbprints on the bronze, which I find really interesting. In terms of the timing and her reworking things, to be honest, I don't know if she would go back and revisit things. 'Cause obviously the plaster would dry though. She only had a certain amount of time with the wet plaster.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, so that would be some immediacy, which I think would kind of come through from the drawings, and then she can chisel it. But to be honest, I don't know how long she would take once it had dried.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of her working in themes, so clearly there's lots of variations on themes, but the technique itself, if it's sculpture and working in plaster, then you have to work quickly. So I think that would probably answer your question.
Just two last questions.
I was just going back to that technique, because there was a very interesting, the 1985 interview, because I don't know what I'd get them to do, because either they'd make the plaster too quickly or they'd make it too slowly, and it wouldn't be at the right consistency when I needed it. So only I can make the plaster, and also they can't help me. I have to put the plaster on myself. So I think it's maybe she had different things on the go, and it sounded to me as if she would revisit, which is absolutely a typical sculptural thing often. So you'd get to one level and you'd what's that kind of Michelangelo Fury, and you'd work at it, and then you'd leave it, and then you'd come back and you'd be satisfied with it. You'd put another layer of plaster on it, and then you'd start to carve back into it. So I think the idea of working technique, I think it was very, very quick and spontaneous. So you've got the sort of rapid hand action of that the plaster to a certain thickness, letting it dry in 5 minutes and immediately getting a chisel to it, and then it hardens very quickly, and then you have to go back again. So I think there's a lot of revisiting and repetition, and again thinking about how Degas worked. I'm not sure she was very aware of it, but there are.
You can see the Hessian there, so worth having a quick look.
I was just wondering, in parallel with the comments on the feminist aspects of her work, right at the very beginning of the day, there was some discussion of the environmental impact of her work. And I'm just interested, thinking about that, in the sense that, she wasn't a sort of, I'll turn this into a question. Am I right in thinking that she wasn't a kind of should we recycle our plastic sort of person, but she was more like a horse whisperer. She would feel, what the heck are we doing to our with all this plastic? Was there an environmental agenda there? Did it flow deep and alongside, in a way, her very bold humanity in these sculptures of people alongside the cat, the birds, the horses, the creatures? I'd just be interested if anybody has comments on that.
Kip, did that come up in conversation?
It's difficult to place yourself back in my case, the 80s, without the environmental imperative that we now feel. You have to rewind yourself back a bit. To somebody who loved the country scene, and in fact I know, that her main driver was things like Amnesty International. That's where her heart lay. That's it.
Anyone else like to add anything?
She was obviously very aware of global issues, because that was reflected in her work and the interviews. So I should think the environment, being a nature lover, came into that quite profoundly. But to what extent, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would place her as an artist who was, it might start off with a photograph or something. She was looking at what was going on around her, and these things were feeding into her work. So I think the answer, for me, the answer would be, I think she probably looked at almost everything, or as much as she could, and it would play its part. We know about her concerns in terms of how victims of their beliefs was a concern to her, and it came into her work. The environment more generally, I think it doesn't seem to enter the work, but I suspect she was interested.
Yeah. She's quite a universally minded person, wasn't she? And her work was very universal in a way. So.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we're probably getting towards the end then. Prerona, do you have anything to add or?